All of us have gone to a meeting, or I should say a movie, and we find ourselves wondering what in the world was the point of that movie. We don't want to admit it. Like, we don't want to. If we came in contact with the director of the movie, we wouldn't tell them, boy, your movie was dog water. It was awful. But there's a part of us that doesn't quite know why it didn't work. And this comes down to the idea of storytelling, which is literally the name of the company that I run, Glint Storytelling Group. So I want to jump in today and give you some of the pitfalls that you as a leader may fall into if you're trying to tell a story. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Sam Linton Show, the podcast designed to help you shift your mindset, find your voice, and change your world. Sam is a pastor, coach, and expert communicator, helping leaders and entrepreneurs like you step into their purpose, speak with confidence, and make a lasting difference. So let's dive in.
So I was stricken by watching this speaker speak at an event that I was at. And the speaker, I can't say enough good about him. I mean, he was really an amazing, accomplished person. He certainly deserved the keynote slot because of what he had done. And he'd written books and he was all over the world speaking. And again, because I'm a speaker and a speaking coach, I always chew the meat and spit out the bones. You might think I'm terrible when it comes to how I feel judgmental when people are speaking. That's not true at all, because I know what it takes and what you have to do in order to hone your craft to be a good speaker. But I will sometimes notice things that are glaring that I will see if a person would change like 3 or 4 things in their talk. They would go from having a talk that is good to a talk that people will be remembering for a long time. So this person had a particular set of things that I noticed about them. And I decided to make some notes about them and not make it about them, because it's really not about them. It's about the things that we all go through when we're telling stories, because that's one of the best ways. I mean, you want to tell a story. I'm reading a book right now called Resonate. And there's so much to be said about when you're speaking to really master the art, and it is an art, of storytelling. But just like with any art, there are some pitfalls that you can find yourself trapped in if you're trying to communicate, especially if you're an executive leader, because as an executive, I always say this, your words weigh more. They're heavier. And you have to learn how to really wield those. It's like Thor's hammer. You don't want to come in and just flip it around like you could kill people. So your words are important. I don't want to scare you, but I also don't want to make it such a flippant point that your words matter. So you want to make sure that when you're speaking, you're doing so with the best words that you can use. So I'm going to give you some of the pitfalls of storytelling. I try to touch on the to-dos a lot more in my podcast, but I'm going to tell you the avoids with this particular one. So let's start us off with pitfall number 1. If you're an executive leader, if you speak to your team or you speak to a mixed audience of people, one of the number 1 ways that you will turn people off is what I call center stage syndrome, or simply making yourself the hero. This is when, as you're speaking, every bit of the conversation ends up landing on you. And it's anecdotal. It's about how you've applied things. It's about how you've done things. And it's you. It's like that Toby Keith song. Remember, I want to talk about me. You want to talk about I want to talk about number one. Oh, my. You know that song? If you don't, you should look it up. I don't know what it's called, actually. But Toby Keith, I think it's I want to talk about you, or you want to talk about you, whatever it is. And it's a funny song because he talks about how the girl that he's dating only talks about herself. And my point, R.I.P. Toby Keith, by the way, really good artist. But my point is, this is something that an audience can smell from a mile away. When you turn inspiration into self-inflation and you focus on yourself, you become the hero. Every punchline involves you being the one that solves the problem. Every turn of the corner of a story or data point is how you figured it out. We can see this in a very quick way, that you are insecure and you're outing yourself by talking this way. So when you make yourself the hero, you inevitably kind of alienate the audience. Now, Donald Miller has a better way of framing it. He basically says that when you're speaking, you want to make them the hero, the audience the hero. The Story Brand framework has a section in the framework called the customer as the hero. And so you are coming along not as a hero, but a guide, someone that has been where the hero is, and you're trying to show them what's important for them. So I'm not saying you can't use anecdotes, but I'm saying you have to be careful that you don't elevate yourself so much that people are listening to you saying, oh my gosh, this guy or this gal, all they're doing is talking about them. And I know they're rich, they did this, they accomplished this, they have all this stuff. And there's appropriate places to talk about yourself, but you have to be cautious that you are not the center stage of everything. They will tune you out if you are the one that always wins. So I would want to encourage you to think about, if you're thinking about your stories, better to discuss your failures. I know that sounds counterintuitive. Now, I don't want you to only talk about your failures, but if you get up and talk about a time when you royally blew it, like when you royally lacked in confidence, when you maybe didn't have the right wisdom, maybe when you lost the plot, people will connect to you more. Your team will connect to you more. And I've never met a member of a team who didn't grow closer to their leader when they heard the leader speak from a place of self-deprecation. It really is a tool that you can lean on. So don't make yourself the hero. That's pitfall number one. And in line with this, pitfall number two is similar. Always trying to look perfect. So over polishing a talk. So pitfall number two is trying to look good instead of being a real person. And I've talked about this so much, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but this is presentation mode version of you. This is when every word is the right word, everything is perfect, you sound more like an AI robot instead of a person who you'd actually have a conversation with. And that is another thing that kind of puts people off. As an executive, of course you want to be prepared. Of course you want to know your topic. But you want to skirt the line between knowing your stuff and sounding like a robot. And I would like to really guide this to you in your stories. You want to make sure that when you're telling the stories, you want to tell them as if you're telling them to somebody at the bar or at the coffee shop, and not like you're telling it to as the final answer or the final answer on Jeopardy, right? You don't want to word it perfectly. You want to word it in an authentic way where you have the key points memorized, but it's not so polished that it sounds like you're reading a manuscript. I was listening to, I listened to a lot of preachers, and I listened to sermons, a ton of sermons, occupational research, occupational hazard, whatever you want to call it. And one of the things I'm noticing about some newer preachers, and I was like this when I first started preaching too, is they manuscript their talks. And I don't know right now, I have to probably do some study on this. I think this might be a big problem because of AI. Because AI right now can manuscript something for you, and you can throw some points in there, it'll manuscript. You got to be careful about manuscripting, because remember, people don't talk the way that they write. So you might be an excellent writer, and that's why I say that authors often have the most difficult time speaking, because you might know the words, but your words, when you're speaking, still have to have the rough edges of a communicator and not someone that is speaking perfectly. Remember, when you're reading something, you're expecting it to be polished. When you're hearing somebody talk, you're expecting to have a conversation. So I want to encourage you to not polish as much as you put yourself out there as putting yourself in a bit of a risky place, putting yourself in a bit of a, I'm just going to level with you, this is what happened here, and try to be relatable instead of looking perfect. All right? Okay, so we got those. 2, how you look. Making yourself the hero, don't do it. Try to look good instead of being real, don't do it. All right, pitfall number, trace, or 3, or trio, whatever you want to call it, is when you tell a story that is irrelevant. This is something that I would probably call cool story, wrong meeting. Cool story, wrong meeting. So I'll give you an example. I am a writer. I write fiction and nonfiction. I'm a speaker, and I train people to speak. I'm an executive trainer, coach, all that. And I'm also a preacher. So here's what would be irrelevant. If I got up and told my best preacher story, like I told the story about the time that I forgot my microphone, and then the microphone died, and then the other microphone died, and then the my slide crashed, and I could tell all those stories, and it would make a good story. I have those. They're great. But let me tell you where they would fail. If I was speaking to a group of writers and I use that as my story. Because the writers are going to be listening and they're going to be wondering, okay, this guy wrote like 6 books, and I want to hear about his writing. I don't care about his preaching and how he manages the tech team at church and how they do that. Like, it's irrelevant. It might be a good story, but it's not appropriate for the meeting. So there's a couple rules I have about stories. You can take your stories and segregate them based on occasion. And you could even use a story for different occasions. However, before you tell a story, you have to know how that story connects to your audience. It's not just a cool story unless it's cool for them. So if I was talking to a group of writers, I might talk to them about a time that I almost threw an entire novel out because I got stuck in the middle. And what it's like to get stuck. Writer's block, project block, whatever you want to call that. That would be a better story. It would be relevant. Same as it would be irrelevant for me to get up this weekend. I'm speaking at church this weekend and get up and say, hey, I want to tell you about how to overcome writer's block. The church people, maybe 2 people might find that interesting, but they're not there to hear me talk about writing. They're there to hear me talk about Jesus and connecting Jesus Christ to their life, not to hear me talk about the importance of making sure that your ending of your book ties into the beginning. Like, they're not going to, it's irrelevant to them, right? So you want to make sure that the stories that you tell them are relevant. So make sure that when you're looking at your stories, that you make sure that you think about your audience and what they need, and ask yourself, is this going to help them? Is this helpful for them? Or is this just a cool story, bro? Is that what this is? Am I cool story broing this until, the end of the message, right? So make sure you don't tell an irrelevant story, even if it's a good story. If a good story is told to the wrong audience, it's a bad story, and it's not going to win you brownie points. People are going to say, that story was funny. What the heck did that have to do with quantum physics, right? So keep that in mind. All right, next of all, back with irrelevance, another thing is telling too many details. Again, I've harped on this enough in other podcasts, but it's worth repeating, specifically with regard to stories, that sometimes we think that every single detail must be included, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. You want to make sure that the details that you choose to include are relevant for the purpose of the story. And this is where you can most massage the stories to suit an audience. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to be speaking at a very large tech conference in Pittsburgh. And I was working on my talk, and of course I have an amalgamation, I don't know if that's a word, or an accumulation, I should say, of a bunch of different talks I've given and a bunch of different coaching talks I've given all over the place. And there's one particular story that is touched on in my other talks, and I don't really elaborate on it. It's about when I worked with a software engineer. Well, I am taking that story and I am blowing it up and telling more details of that story to this group, because this group is going to most benefit from knowing what a software engineer worries about when they speak, as opposed to me talking more about executives and how executives speak. Now, you might say, well, I mean, what difference does it make? It makes a big difference, because the details that I'm going to include in this story when I'm talking to this group are going to be a lot different than the details that I used when I told that story when I talked to a group of executives. The executives didn't need to know all of the ins and outs of the technical work that I did with this particular leader. But this group that I'm speaking to, they're going to want to know those details because they are into data. Now, all this to say, it matters what your audience wants to hear and what is going to move them the most. So if you fill even the greatest story with irrelevant details, that story, similar to if you tell an irrelevant story to a group, it's not going to land. They're going to be like, okay, that story was so long. Why did he talk about the color of his wife's dress and how, they messed up on the ticket for the bus and it should have been a train ticket? Like, what does that have to do, again, with me trying to figure out how to balance the federal budget? You have to know your audience enough to know which details are relevant or which details they will appreciate. And this is where practice will often help. So for this upcoming talk, to come back to show you how this works in a practical way, I'm going to canary the talk to somebody who's really in that tech space. I'm not a technical person. In fact, I was told by the leader of the conference that I'm the only non-technical presenter that they have. No pressure, but what am I going to do before this talk? Am I going to just sharpen up my skills? No, I'm going to talk to the most technical men and women that I have in my life to try to get to see what it is that they want to hear most of, and then I'm going to tailor my talk to them instead of just trying to lean in on my own strength, if that makes sense. So I will make sure the details are relevant to them and them alone, because they're the ones that matter at the end of the day, not how good my story is. My story is woefully bad if it's not serving the people that it's being told to. All right? Last but not least, and this is a doozy, and I have failed at this a lot, is spending time telling the story, but skipping the point. You might call this a transition, you might call this a key takeaway, but there are many times when I have really focused on telling a story, getting a punchline in, talking to the audience, getting a connection, but never explaining why it matters to the rest of my talk. So that story is left in a siloed island, just dangling out there, and people get it. They see how it's relevant to them. They see how it's good for them and it's entertained them, but they don't really see the tie-in to the remaining part of my message. I'll give you an example that's really, really relevant. This past weekend, in church, and forgive me for talking about church stuff, but remember, I'm a Jesus guy. I preach, so you're going to get a lot of those examples. I was talking about people's ideology, what they believe about life and where they get that from, and how it relates to their theology. And if your theology isn't right, your ideology is going to become your theology. It's the whole point of my sermon. I know it's a lot of ologies, but I explained it and I spent a long time with it. I wrestled with this sermon a lot because it was a little heavier and headier, because it's been about what happened with Charlie Kirk's assassination and what's going on in our culture and different things of that nature. And so it was a heavy type of sermon, but I had a critique group tell me, make sure they understand the point of sharing the difference between theology and ideology. Don't just say those things, but actually give them the definitions and tell them why it's important. Spend extra time. So I took what this critique group said very seriously. I spent most of my time going over those terms and being comfortable with those terms so that they could see what is the point of me telling them about this and how it relates to them. So the sermon, and it was one of the hardest sermons I preached in a while. I just between me, you, and the lamppost, I didn't particularly like it because it was harder, but people seemed to enjoy it. And I would tell you that the reason why they enjoyed it is because of the advice that I got from those people that critique my sermon. So again, I will always encourage you to get accountability and get some feedback. It helps. So if you have a people like that in your life and you want feedback, that's a good way to start. If you want professional coaching, I'm the person that can help you with that, because this is what I do for a living. This is what I do for my business. This is what I do for the church. And there are very few people that I would say this person's qualified to help you more than me, but I would love to help you because I really want to make you a better speaker. So if that's something that could interest you, podcast@samuellinton.com. And I could let you know about some fall programs that we're offering that could get you connected. But keep this in mind. When you're coming to the end, make sure you transition into, why did I just tell you this story? Okay? Why does this story matter to you? Why does this story matter to what I'm going to say? Why do you need to remember this story when you're thinking about yourself? Whatever. You want to make sure that it's crystal clear why that story has a point. So it has to connect to the broader scope of whatever it is that you're teaching them, or else the story is going to be engaging, maybe relevant, maybe entertaining, but it might end up kind of dangling out there and left for interpretation. You have to tell them why the story is useful. All right, so now I'm going to give you some bonus pitfalls of story, because we have a little bit of extra time here. These are short, but you get what you get. It's for what you pay for. It's free. But I'll give you a couple quick rapid fire bonuses. All right, number one, don't do this. Start too far back. Usually stories are best told when they're right in the middle of the action. That's a writer term for that, called in medias res. It's right in the middle of action. It's right in the middle of something happening. But a lot of times people will start off by saying, I knew a guy named Joe, and Joe grew up next to me, and Joe was a great basketball player, and I used to envy him. And then we finally get to where the story should have started. Joe came into my house and said, you have to get down to the station quickly, or else your mother is going to be arrested. All right, that's where I'd start the story. We could fill in details about Joe, but we don't need most of them. We just want to know, oh my goodness, what's happened to this dude's mom? Is she really going to be arrested? We start the story back too far because we are desperately concerned that people aren't going to understand our story. And so in the fear of them not understanding, we overload them with details and we start too far back. So don't start too far back. Next thing, don't end without some sort of transition. I already said this with the last pitfall, skipping the point, but make sure that you have some sort of transition. So based on this is where we discover this. Or now that you know my fear of heights, let's talk about your fear of being in a group and speaking, right? Whatever that transition is, give yourself a transition. Next, don't become a one-trick pony with stories. A lot of times we'll tell the same story over and over and over and over and over, and people have heard it. And I'm kind of a stickler on, you should use a story more than once, but you have more than one story. I think you should have a handful of stories, a repository of stories, if you will, that you can use, but be careful that you don't constantly say the same story so much that people can tell the end of your story before you finish it. And then finally, context. Don't forget the context of why you were asked to speak. Don't forget the context of what your audience wants. Don't forget the context of the rest of your talk. You have to put it into context. If that story doesn't have context, it's not going to have connection. And if you don't have connection, you're wasting people's time. So, again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being a part of the Sam Linton Show. Ooh, I want to tell you, I should have probably led with this. We have officially surpassed 1,000 downloads. I feel like we should have a party, like some sort of giveaway, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate you listening for this long. We've been at this for 6 months, but 1,000 downloads of this, and I hope that it's blessed your life. I pray that God has used it for your own professional development, and if it has been used, if the Sam Linton Show has been used for that, don't be afraid to drop me a line at podcast@samuellinton.com, because I'm really glad to see that what I'm doing is impacting you in some way. So, until next time, thank you for joining our show. Shift your mindset, find your voice, change your world. We'll see you soon.